Hidden Secrets of Florida Springs is supported by a grant from the Dolores Barr Weaver Fund at the Community Foundation for Northeast Florida. Additional funding comes from the FERN Foundation and Wekiva Island, where you can experience the real Florida. With its underpinning of porous limestone, the geologically young peninsula of Florida is home to some 1,000 freshwater springs, more than any other region in the world. These springs fuel many rivers, and for thousands of years were considered sacred by early Native Americans who believed they possessed magical, life-giving qualities. They were also the first tourist attractions in the 1800s, when steamboat-bound visitors were lured here by the mystical and healing qualities of the springs. The clear waters of these vibrant pools were once the stage set for early films and broadcast programs, including several Tarzan movies from the 1930s to the 1950s, as well as Sea Hunt in the 1960s. This otherworldly allure was not lost on early artists, writers, and natural historians. In the 1700s, naturalist and explorer William Bartram wrote, "Florida springs are the blue ether of another world." In the early 1900s, highly regarded scientist Archie Carr said each is a little ecological jewel in which geology and biology have created a masterwork of natural art.
So you would have to actually put your hands on the guideline, kind of just fingering it and follow the guideline out. So that navigational tool to get out. But exploring these caves has changed my life. They're so mysterious and magical. One of the most fascinating things with me is revealing these secrets of Florida springs. These fossils of mastodons, very rare animals, and tons of plants that are not found anywhere else. And it amazes me just how complex it really is to watch water flow through rocks. And thanks to the hard work of others, we're just now starting to really understand how complex this really is.
But there are other, more dangerous secrets that, if allowed to continue, will destroy these sacred fountains. Silver Springs, once the most powerful in the entire world, with a flow of 500 million gallons of water a day, will go dry in 15 to 20 years if current trends continue, scientists say. And its once transparent pool, already home to stringy green algae, will become a stagnant sinkhole. Sadly, all of our springs face the same threats.
As a guy who fell in love with the magic and mystical powers of the springs, I just want to find a way to learn how we can avoid all of this. To do so, I'm asking some really smart friends to help me understand the complexity of all this science.
Margaret Ross Tolbert is an artist who snorkels in springs and then later paints them, helping greatly expand the awareness of springs beyond those who are only interested in the technology. Her award-winning art book, Aquiferius, is likely the largest single collection of art that focuses exclusively on our springs, as well as linking the world of art, science, and culture. Katie Moncrief, with her late husband Russ, ran an outfitting business called Katie's Landing for almost 30 years on the spring-fed Wekiva River, renting canoes and kayaks. She understands the pure joy the springs can evoke and worries if they will still be flowing for future generations. Former Florida Governor and U.S. Senator Bob Graham has always been a proponent of using nature in a responsible way, He also understands how Florida springs have been deeply woven into the health of the state's economy.
I'm hoping these informed and caring people can alert us to the really finite boundaries of our magical spring.
The springs are also a window into the health of the Floridian aquifer, which provides drinking water for 90% of residents and tourists. If it were to dry up, scientists say we can expect an economic impact in the billions of dollars. Perhaps the most ironic of our spring secrets is that even those with little regard for these natural features will be deeply affected by this financial disaster. There may be no better example of these natural secrets than the classic pre-Disney tourist attraction known as Silver Springs. Today, Governor Graham visits the site to help bring a realistic perspective to this crisis.
Like most young people of the 1930s and 40s, my family brought me here. I think right after World War II was over and gas rationing had ended and you could get enough gasoline to drive from South Florida up to Silver Springs. Floridians tended to think of this state as being a commodity. There was nothing distinguished about it. It was a long way away. It was a relatively small and poor state. And if you didn't like what you saw, if it was wet and you wanted it dry, you filled it in. If it was dry and you wanted it wet, you dug it up, and nobody cared. After World War II, as the population began to grow and the state became more aware of what was happening to our natural beauty and natural resources, there was a new ethic. Instead of commodity, we began to think of Florida as being a treasure, a very special place on this planet for which we had the opportunity to live and enjoy, but had a responsibility to see that future generations would have the same experience. We had a very strong ethic of environmental responsibility for about 40 years. And just in the recent past, that seems to have waned. How much can we take out of the environment of Florida? How much water can we take out of Silver Springs? How much pollutant can we dump into it as a free sewer, as opposed to our children and grandchildren? My standard is I want my grandchildren, when they're as old as I am today, to be able to stand on this very spot and see a dramatically better Silver Springs than we will see today.
Governor Graham also understands the fallacy in which many believe that jobs and real estate development are more important than anything else when it comes to the Florida economy.
The argument that there is a conflict between environmental protection and our economy, I think, is a false one. The fact is, Florida doesn't have oil, we don't have coal, we don't have iron, we don't have the natural resources that fueled the Industrial Revolution. What we do have is the most pleasant place to live, the greatest climate, and the most diverse and fertile environment on the planet. That is our economic asset.
This is one of our favorite spots in the Floridian aquifer in the Ocala Limestone Formation. It's an old tourist trap called Ocala Caverns right on 441, and it's been numerous things over the years, and we have our good old friends from the Florida Speleologic Society who manage this property, and they take care of it and make sure it's accessible to people who are learning and enjoying the Floridian aquifer.
Although the site is no longer open to the public, the Florida Speleological Society uses it to educate certain scholars, students, and government officials to the way the aquifer creates caves. For this reason, we can consider the cavern a tourist cave, since visitors can graphically see the science of geology and hydrology brought to life.
we need tourist caves. There's a lot of exploration and a lot of really difficult places to go to see the Floridian aquifer and the underground rivers it creates. But we need tourist caves so that people can actually learn about them, can come in and see them, and can experience what us explorers experience. They can experience what Bill Birdsall has seen over 30 years of climbing around in the Floridian aquifer. And so without a tourist cave, it really stops the education. The caves are half filled with air and half filled with water. So we have all three levels. We have the air passages of the cave, we have the water table level of the cave, which where we're at now, and then it submerges and we continue off cave diving down into the depths of the aquifer.
Most of the limestone caves in this part of Florida were formed through dissolution. The rainwater, when this part of Florida became exposed after the Pleistocene, the rainwater collected a little bit of carbon dioxide and became slightly acidic. And it fell into tiny crevices and actually dissolved the limestone away. The fossils that you find in this limestone are actually from the sea creatures that the limestone is actually made of. Those are millions of years old sea creatures that had fallen to the bottom of an ancient ocean that used to be here.
We're standing in rainwater that sometimes may have rained 10 years ago or 200 years ago, or maybe last week, depending on where it's coming from. So there's so much unknown, very similar to the depths of the ocean or the space in the planets. Right here beneath our feet in Florida, there's things going on that we don't know. And ordinary people just have no idea. They don't realize it. They don't realize that there's a natural network of underground rivers right under their feet. And the more you disturb them, the more they're going to change.
Scientist Dr. Aaron Mills agrees. He says that while springs are not unique to Florida, the abundance of them in the landscape of this peninsula surely is.
I think we're the only group that's actively measuring water quality parameters down inside, so we get some idea.
We get together every few years with like-minded scientists who are working on springs globally. We work with Europeans, we work with folks in other parts of the country, comparing and contrasting their systems with ours. And as a result, we're learning more and more all the time about the processes that occur deep in the springs. The springs represent an important window into the groundwater, and by looking at the quality of the water that's coming out of the ground, these are good markers of what the quality of the groundwater is. If we see degradation of the springs, we can be sure that the water that feeds them, the groundwater, which is the same groundwater that constitutes the drinking water supply for most of the population here, is being degraded as well.
The actual dissolution of the limestone here reflects how rainwater creates all of our Florida springs. The younger, less solid karst limestone is far easier to dissolve than much older limestone deposits elsewhere in the world.
To help visualize what our aquifer looks like, I invite Governor Graham, Margaret, and Katie into Ocala Caverns to see it for themselves. As non-divers, it's the only way they can see it.
Gosh, look at this. Oh my God, it's so bad. That's amazing.
Oh,
it's like a door with a spring.
Fantastic. Boy, it's hard to believe that this is sitting under several 100,000 people.
Oh my God.
You guys just
Under the
entered
highways.
the Floridian aquifer.
Yeah.
This
You're inside the
is
aquifer right now.
Yeah.
just beautiful.
The rocks are, the stones are so white, so brilliantly white. We're not used to seeing this.
The great thing about here in this part of Florida is we can access the top of the aquifer. Right here we have the air passages of the aquifer, the water table level of the aquifer, and then underwater the cave dives that go down beneath. All right here, we can access every bit of it and bring people and show them exactly what we experienced way deep back in an underwater cave.
Are most of these caves accessible to the public, or can people learn? This seems an excellent way to learn about aquifer and our water.
The Florida Speleologic Society manages numerous cave systems throughout Florida, and if people get interested and want to be involved with agencies like this, then they can schedule trips and go and learn in a very professional manner.
just like maybe the Everglades, there are a lot of natural places in Florida where people want to be part of saving and restoring and returning them to their natural qualities.
Yeah, I always have the feeling that others in charge of policies just really don't know how strongly we feel about this. I mean, they don't know about this conversation, although hopefully they will. And if there's some way for us to, get their voices heard for this, so.
A good way to understand how vital freshwater springs have historically been is to let scientists explain how springs dramatically shaped the Native American culture in Florida when they first began to flow. At the end of the last ice age, the early peninsula was very arid and populated with animals like mastodons that roamed wildly. The Paleo-Indians here were very nomadic, ranging great distances to hunt for food and water. But when the earliest springs, like those feeding the Wekiva, first began to flow 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, it allowed the Indians to camp near places where both water and food were more readily available.
The flow of the springs, I think, affected the communities in this area substantially. And this would have been, again, around 6,000 to 5,500 years ago. First of all, food resources, right? Every human population needs a durable food resource. The fact that we had standing water on the landscape and a spring that was charged from the aquifer provided a constant water resource, but also all the animals that are associated with that water resource. So we have, of course, the banded mystery snail and other mollusks. We have turtles, we have alligators, we have the snakes and other reptiles that are involved, and also the mammals, medium-sized mammals, white-tailed deer. So the draw of the spring and the water flow definitely attracted food resources that led to more permanently settled populations on the landscape. And when you have more permanently settled populations, you start to develop things like more complex ceremonial practice, ritual practices, and we can see that in the development of some of the ceramics and other artifacts that we find here at the site. So here I'm holding early fiber-tempered pottery sherd. This is just a piece of a larger vessel. This is an example of one of the earliest ceramics found in Florida. Very important on the riverway for cooking and for storage. We also have alongside these some continued hunting tools. This is a stone projectile point called an archaic stemmed projectile point.
Dr. Walls' insights remind us that just as our flowing springs shaped the early culture of the Native Americans here, that energy also influenced artists, poets, and writers. Naturalist William Bartram, who explored the St. Johns River in the 1700s, was clearly inspired by the ethereal qualities of the springs. After visiting Blue Spring, Salt Springs, and several others, Bartram wrote of an enchanting and amazing crystal fountain, the waters of which are so extremely clear as to be as transparent as the ether. Within one crystal fountain were what Bartram called a prodigious number and variety of fish. They appear as though lying on a table before you, although they are many feet deep in the water. His vivid description of Salt Springs inspired British poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1797 to write passionately of Xanadu. This Xanadu was a mystical place where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. Salt Springs still flows today, and its 5-mile run confluxes with the massive Lake George, a dilation of the St. Johns River. Other contemporary artists, including nature photographer John Moran, have also been deeply inspired by the springs. Today, John joins Margaret Tolbert at the edge of Gilchrist Blue Spring in northern Florida.
Here on the banks of the mighty Blue Springs. There are so many Blue Springs in Florida, but I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. You know, it's like if you're a parent, you can't say which is your favorite child, but I love all the springs of Florida, but this just might be my favorite Blue Springs. We know that we're wired for aquatic seduction. That's part of the human experience, but Why do you suppose that the color makes such a difference in terms of that visceral response? Why does that matter?
Yeah, there's some kind of Jungian archetype for that blue. And that blue.
I think I guess it speaks to the purity, you know, because we're just drawn to it. It just feels like just the essence of what water wants to be is the water that flows from these springs.
Yes.
So,
and also it looks like a great distance we can travel into, whether it's the infinite blue of the sky or the infinite blue underwater when you have that underwater horizon.
yeah.
It's like we can go there and escape. So.
Well, I love it that Blue Springs was on the cover of your wonderful Aquaferius book, and I know that this has been a deeply inspiring place for you.
Oh man. And it went from at first, I think I came here to picnics and I just didn't get it. And then I would swim maybe or run somewhere else or see it in the background. Like so many people, it's in the background behind the barbecue. And then when you enter the springs, then everything changes in your life. It's just a big eureka moment. So that was true. First place I painted a spring was, for me, it was real important to be able to sort of see the inside of the spring instead of, if I saw the head spring from an angle, it didn't get me. It didn't make me feel like I was in it from the surface. But once I saw a little blue, and I saw that big drop, it's like you're right in the bottom of the springs with that little cave. That did it. So then it kind of let me in.
The reality is that we're killing our springs and that we're poisoning our drinking water. And as you and I have both seen, there's something about the power of art to inspire people to resonate with that which matters deeply in our lives. Nobody wants to be told what to do, but I think that what we both do in our own way is to encourage people to be open to the possibilities of what they can do in their own life, to harness their creative energies, their passions, to inspire others, to live more mindfully, and to make choices that reflect the reality that we have a social contract with the future, and that we are obligated, even if we lack the wisdom and the compassion to clean up our springs as a matter of enlightened self-interest in the here and now, we're obligated, we're called to do so on behalf of those who surely will follow us here. So that's part of our mission.
Yeah.
That's a big part of the job description, to just be an artist. You know,
I know.
Yeah.
Both John and Margaret are also deeply concerned about the market decline we've been seeing over the last few years. John was inspired to assemble a dynamic collection of photos at the Florida Museum of Natural History in an exhibition called Springs Eternal. As he says in the publication for the exhibit, for more than 30 years, I've been on a search for these pools of stunning blue wonder.
You know, if you had a friend that you wouldn't put the friend's eyes out, you would help to carry this friend to a better place to heal, you know, if you really truly cared for it. So we need to demand accountability. We need everybody to know that this is important. And I guess I also think not only the beautiful waters that are a result, the whole karst landscape that we have here, if it's not infused with water, it implodes, it collapses.
It's a wake-up call, and that's part of the power of art, is let the artists be the soothsayers. So you go, Margaret.
Yeah. Go to
I know it's cheesy to say it, but Florida needs organ donors. We need 20 million Floridians who are willing to give their hearts for Florida. In the area.
As artists, both John and Margaret are aware of the poet Thomas More's insight into the true dynamics of art. Art, he said, is not about the expression of pretty things. It's about the preservation and containment of our collective soul, the soul of humans, the soul of nature, the soul of the earth. Later, the renowned biologist E.O. Wilson coined the term biophilia, explaining that we humans need to have natural places to exalt.
That old uncle out there about his Spanish, other end left on the scope. The bow of it up front. You know, we all have an ink plotter.
Today, Eric is getting ready to immerse himself deep inside the waters of Silver Springs. The hope is that his explorations and maps will help people gradually understand the value of upland recharge areas, where rainfall seeps through the earth and soft limestone. His point? to graphically alert others to the extensive underground journeys in which this water can flow for miles before it emerges as a spring. As it does, it may travel under septic tanks, fertilized land, and many, many wells.
The cool part of the springs is they're kind of like a time capsule. Like right behind me here at Silver Springs, underneath the water, underneath the silt, underneath the algae is a vast array of artifacts from the whole history of Florida, from 40 million years ago to today. All the things that went in the water and were created in the geology. This is a mastodon tooth. And all of the remains of everything that happened 10,000 years ago is right here in the bottom of this spring. Another part of Silver Springs is the tourists and people who come here and they walk out and they look at this river. They think this is the beginning of the river. Actually, this is just where the river comes out of the ground. So as explorers into the aquifer, we go to try and put our nose in the flow and follow that water and see where these big aquifers are going.
Although we are just learning about the precise science of our springs, anthropologist Dr. Daniel Britton first visited Silver Springs in 1856 and came away in awe of what he described as perfectly diaphanous liquid flowing from the earth. He regarded it as one of the great natural features of the North American continent, like Niagara Falls or the Grand Canyon. The complexities of silver are simply not visible to the average above-ground tourist. As a result, it's more difficult for most people to fully appreciate the hidden geological underpinnings of Silver Springs. In a way, we can think of Silver Springs, as Eric tells us, like the Grand Canyon, but with a lid. Undoubtedly, all of our springs fit that definition. Here, in one of Eric's maps, we can see the configurations of the dark and hidden water-filled tunnels that feed the powerful Silver Glen Springs in the Ocala National Forest before it emerges from the earth. Regardless of their size, our springs spend an essential portion of their existence meandering through the darkness of the limestone. This is as true for the powerful first magnitude springs as it is for the smaller and more remote springs, some of which are still being discovered.
And here at the Seminole State Forest, we have a microcosm of the Floridian aquifer and its recharge area. Right over here is a very natural recharge area where all the rainwater comes down on this sand hill and runs underground and seeps out at the springs and the little rivers that we're getting ready to go walk to down here. Where you can take this model and really learn from it of how it works and where it goes and how easy it is to get polluted. Great thing about the Seminole State Forest is it's protected. So the rainwater and the recharge area that comes out here is very pristine. So as we go and look at these springs out here, it's beautiful, pristine water, unpolluted. Such a beautiful slice of undisturbed Florida. Beautiful, pristine water coming out of a 5th magnitude spring, which is just as important as a 1st magnitude spring. Florida's sea bottom past is the fossils, the parts that made up the limestone. Some places they're scattered everywhere. Like here, we can just dig up in a handful of muck. Look at that. And there's riddled with fossils from a past age, Florida's sea bottom past. Here it's shark's teeth. These sharks swam here 20 million years ago as the limestone was formed. So here at another remote part of Florida, Boulder Spring, deep within the Seminole State Forest, miles from anything, It's a really good spot to see the gravitational flow of the water coming right out of the side of the hill. And it's seeking its path of least resistance, coming right out of the side of the hill, flowing down this little spring run, intersecting with numerous creeks and Blackwater creeks and Wekiva River, and finally working its way to the St. Johns and all the way out to the estuaries into the Atlantic Ocean.
But if the government has protected certain spring systems inside of state forests and parks, the state literally drowned at least 20 of them in 1964 when it attempted to create a barge canal to allow large ships to cross the peninsula without traveling all the way to the Keys. In doing so, it built a reservoir damming the bucolic Ocklawaha River, a picturesque waterway fueled by one of the world's greatest collections of first magnitude springs, as well as by the flow of the Silver River. Poet Sidney Lanier, who visited the Ocklawaha by steamship in the 1800s, called it the sweetest water lane in the world. Decommissioned but not yet restored, the reservoir today continues to inundate the springs, except when it's drawn down every 3 to 4 years to manage nuisance plants living in it.
Today, I visit the Ocklawaha during a rare drawdown period with local guide captain Erica Ritter. So here with the drawdown of the Rodman Dam, what happens is the old springs that naturally would run, they start to flow again, and we start to see them again, and we can come and enjoy them again. When the Rodman Dam is up and full, it's like up to here, this deep, and the pressure of the dark water suppresses these springs, and we don't see them, and some of them even start to siphon and turn the other way. Erica remembers how it was when she lived on the shores of the river as a child.
The impacts of the Rodman Dam to me was in my front yard. Our family lost property, we lost creeks, we lost a spring, and we lost Indian mounds that we used to walk across to get to the river.
Migratory fish that swam far upstream on the Ocklawaha to spawn are, of course, no longer here.
It used to be the big thrill at Silver Springs and up and down the river to see the hundreds of big channel and whitecats and schools come up to spawn in the system. I've seen the birds are decreasing because of these big schools of shad. The bait fish that used to come running up in here, all that schools of mullet were good fish for the ospreys and eagles. It's just sad. I mean, we've had the bait stores closing left and right. They can't be supported here. People aren't fishing.
During the drawdown, Captain Erica shows me one of the springs that normally is covered by tons of reservoir water. Wow, that's an amazing little spring. Crystal sands just boiling everywhere. Beautiful limestone, all kinds of life. They call this Cannon Spring. It's covered with dark water for my entire life. I've never seen it before. But when they run off the Rodman Reservoir, it's exposed, and I'm seeing it for the first time. It's like you went back into the Stone Age. Crystal sands, beautiful geology, all teeming with life. The water tastes very good.
But if some springs have been publicly decimated, others, particularly those that create rivers, are defended by those who appreciate the great advantages of the spring system.
The Tamookans and Seminoles lived here. It was a mound. It is an Indian mound. And when we got here, we started digging for wires and plumbing and came up with this wonderful bounty of Indian shards, into pottery shards. And we used to have it on display.
After Katie and her husband Russ bought it to rent kayaks and canoes, they tried to help those who paddled the river understand its very rich, natural, and cultural history. The Moncriefs became stewards of the land and the spring-fed stream and did what they could to engage others with this unique natural system.
We had long-handled nets, and particularly it was intriguing to the kids, and we gave them 5 cents. At first, we gave them 5 cents for every bottle or can or any piece of trash that they picked up. We taught them that it was wrong to throw anything in that beautiful water. They learned a lesson. And we also gave them lists of things to check off as they came down the river. Birds, simple things, birds, turtles, fish.
As the river became more popular and homes were being built in its floodplain, the Moncriefs joined with others to form one of Florida's most successful grassroots advocacy groups, the Friends of the Wekiva. It relied on the united front of both Republicans and Democrats, who were strongly bound together in the defense of their beloved springs and river.
Well, I think it's important for all people that are interested in keeping our springs and our waters clear and healthy, robust, to belong to a support group. We actually brought about 5 governmental designations for the river.
The Wekiva River is not only a federal wild and scenic river. The government has purchased some 110 square miles of land and its watershed for use as parks and preserves. When the Moncriefs were ready to retire recently, they sold the 5-acre Katie's Landing to the state. Nonetheless, the upland recharge areas feeding Florida Springs are not protected in Florida, and those uplands are becoming heavily developed. As a result, both the amount and quality of water flowing from its 40-plus springs has dramatically decreased.
Well, we know that it's not a healthy river right now because we are thirsty people here in Florida. We use it unnecessarily for lawns, for car washing, for unnecessary things. We have septic tanks that need to be on a sewer hookup instead. The seepage into the rivers has caused a lot of pollution. Springs are the birth of the rivers. Everything comes from the aquifer and the springs, and they have to stay healthy and robust, or the rivers themselves are affected immediately.
Katie meets with Sister Pat Seaman at the edges of the massive Volusia Blue Spring, north of the Wekiva. Volusia Blue Spring, which is also declining in flow, has long been an overwintering sanctuary for the warm-blooded mammals known as the manatee. When the waters of the nearby St. Johns River drop into the 50s and below, Blue, like all of Florida Springs, stays at 72 degrees. Sister Pat, who is both a nun and an attorney, is the former director of the Center for Earth Jurisprudence. Its mission is to help raise awareness for the spiritual qualities of our natural lands, while also providing them with legal standing to more fully protect them.
I think that people migrate to the springs even when they're out on a river or a lake here in Florida. You want to know where the lake started and where it goes to, and I think you go to the springs. I do, just to be refreshed and renewed. How about you?
Yes. Well, you know, I think my love for the springs really goes back further to my love for water in general. But when I came to Florida, and especially to Central Florida, I had never really experienced the beauty of our unique springs here. And for me, it touches deeply into my own spiritual hunger and path, because this water just surges up. And it triggers for me in my Christian tradition the whole concept of Jesus saying we have living waters and it comes from the depths. It takes me right back to a lot of the native peoples who have always had a deep respect for springs. And for them, the springs are living beings. They're not resources or commodities. Right. So that their deep reverence for the qualities of that water that comes from the depths, that is nourishing, healing, cleansing.
It actually hurts, doesn't it, when you see some of the destruction that's going on, the pollution.
I'm aware that so many other peoples around the world consider water sacred, And especially also where they do have springs, like in areas of Turkey. I know they have some beautiful springs there. There seems to be a correlation between the amount of biodiversity that is in a community and the amount of cultural diversity that is also represented. Many cultures do actually transmit their artifacts and their art forms as being heavily influenced by the diversity, the biodiversity of the natural world. And that there's this press to just be more and more monoculture, to be more and more consumptive, to be more and more the same. And really one of the laws of the universe is diversity. And the problem with our laws today is that they, by and large, really do not consider nature or Earth's health itself. And so our laws are premised that everything is property and to be owned. So Earth jurisprudence is trying to shift that paradigm or that frame and to say, we need to have laws that are going to protect the inherent value of nature for itself and not just as an instrument for humans. What's interesting about considering granting legal protection to springs is that by protecting their very essence, we actually protect the economy of the state of Florida as well. Because the springs are a huge attraction to tourists and to people who live here and recreational, and they provide so much water that to give them stronger legal protection than what they currently have and to really recognize the contribution they make would really go towards a sustainable Florida.
Meanwhile, former Governor Graham meets with one of the most preeminent springs scientists back at Silver Springs to get some specifics about the demise of silver and other Florida springs.
But it's starting in the 1960s, there's just been a continuing decline in flow. Still, some years are higher than others, but it's been declining the whole time so that we're down about 40% now. In the last decade, we're down about 40% from that historic average flow. The average now is about 40% lower. And rainfall has declined some too, but the overall evidence is that a very large part of these flow declines is due to pumping. It's due to what we're doing as humans. It's not a natural phenomena. And so this is why it's important that we do something about it.
Those are pretty startling statistics. What are the consequences of such a dramatic decline on a sustained basis of the flow in Silver Springs?
This whole aquatic system will essentially die if this spring stops flowing. It will become just a algal bowl, just nothing but algae and a few trash fish and things like that. It won't be a place that anybody will enjoy. The St. Johns River has lost about 40% of its base flow already as a consequence of springs, in addition to silver, but also silver losing their flow. And so we're losing our whole river systems. The aquifer levels are going down just a couple inches a year, and that doesn't seem like much, but that's almost 500 million gallons of less fresh water every day. So we're going to see more saltwater intrusion unless we just start turning around immediately. There's no doubt in my mind. When you came here in '48, and I came here in '53, this spring was full of fish. It was full of fish. I don't see anything like that. I don't see any mullet. And those fish, it turns out, are very important for the ecosystem too. So they're the organisms that were really keeping the algae at bay.
Florida's spring system, reasons Dr. Knight, has an economic value of $10 billion when all of its benefits, from providing drinking water to tourism, are factored into the equation.
What's your assessment of how well these interrelationships, level of flow to saltwater intrusion as one, are understood and are being utilized by decision makers?
It seems that our decision makers are more focused on permitting the withdrawals than understanding the consequences ultimately of what the withdrawals are. That's what it seems to me. We were given this incredible gift of the Florida aquifer, which is the biggest water storage system of fresh water in the state or pretty much in the world. trillions of gallons of fresh water in it. I think it's one of our most important natural resources. I mean, the beaches are a great natural resource for tourism, but for life, it's the Floridan aquifer that makes this state, that makes it really special. There's no doubt that that's not in the public's interest, but the public's not really part of the decision-making process. It's a political process.
Ironically, protection of the springs at the state level has been historically endorsed by voters for the last 30 years. This ethic resulted in the creation of the Florida Springs Task Force by former Governor Jeb Bush in the year 2000. A report from the task force declared that our springs are in serious jeopardy. Scientists have documented a decline in water quality in most springs. A Water Resources Act was created that provided for the recovery of a spring if it falls below its historic flow. The act requires that all of the water management districts in Florida must closely monitor the flow of springs within its realm by setting a regime of minimum flows and levels. If those levels are breached, then the district is required to implement a recovery strategy.
I just make these little sketches with fish and how the blue's different. Here's a turtle.
The task force stressed that education is a vital tool for producing changes in the behavior and land use practices of millions of Floridians. However, more recently, Florida's protective springs laws and its Springs Task Force were defunded at the state level. The national media, including NPR and the New York Times, reported on that loss of protection. And one of Florida's most highly regarded newspapers, the Tampa Bay Times, weighed in several times on the issue. In one editorial, the writers declared, for the last 50 years, Florida's governors have been reasonably responsible stewards of the state's fragile environment. But, according to the editorial, current Governor Rick Scott has bulldozed a record of environmental protection that his Republican and Democratic predecessors spent decades building. State laws designed to protect springs remain on the books, but they are simply not funded, rendering them impotent. Jim Stevenson, the former chief biologist of Florida State Parks, once said our springs are places of natural, social, and economic value, but they are facing death by 1,000 wounds. Stevenson was concise in his warning, hinting that private citizens should take strong action. Florida springs will not protect themselves. Those who know and love them must protect them. In an effort to reflect on both the health and impending loss of all of our springs, several of our group meet back at Silver Springs, which is now owned by the state of Florida. We have learned that Florida's economy has always been based on the health of its natural systems. What can we do to alert others to this reality?
To me, the beginning of the solution is to understand the problem, and I believe there has been an increasing interest and willingness to get involved and get educated by Floridians. So I'm encouraged that where we're still a long way from success, we're better off today than we were 24 months ago.
I feel a lot of people know a lot more than they used to. The springs sort of literacy has really increased, and lots of people, I think it's okay for us to get angry about and demanding what we want to happen with protecting these systems. Or as they say, the system will implode.
Florida happens to be the home of the greatest system of springs on the planet.
It is.
It's the home of one of the great wetlands on the planet, the Everglades. It's the home of several gigantic rivers, the St. Johns and the Apalachicola just being two of those. And we need to develop an ethic that incorporates all of those, or we leave ourselves to the opponents of protection to pick us off one by one.
What kind of improvements do you actually see, Eric, when you're in that water?
Well, right here today at Silver Springs,
Yes.
the water flow coming out of the spring has doubled since 2 years ago when we started. We had a great summer of rain. So I continue to pray for rain. And if we have great summers of rain and it's managed properly, this can be saved.
I think we're at a tipping point now. Now the question is, where do we go from here? The rain was not the result of any politician signing a bill or some directive, let it rain.
So it's just common sense for us to know that this water is coming from somewhere vast. At current trends, this beautiful spring, the world's largest artesian spring, could stop flowing in 15 years. I've got 500 to 1,000 dives here in this spring back into the cave studying it. And to hear that and to feel that, it doesn't compute. I can't get it. So, I mean, just to think that something like that could happen.
I'm sort of a baby of the Springs Initiative movement because I really think being in the Springs is one of the best maybe experience in the planet. It's such a joyfulness. So I can't even really think about what would happen if, as one director of South Florida said, our state implodes because the water is gone from the springs.
Well, I think a fundamental reason for this is that we've been like a child who's been given everything that they need and never had to really extend themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Florida, in reference to water, has been in exactly that position. And so we've sort of taken it for granted. It's like the sun's going to come up every morning. The water will come out of the faucet. And we're only beginning to learn that there are limits. I mean, I'm an optimist, and I think that the battle is eventually going to be won by those who recognize just how fortunate we are to live in this place, and that with that good fortune comes significant obligations, including protecting it for our own immediate benefit, but also to let our future generations experience what a wonderful, special place Florida is.
What it does to me, initially it makes me sick to think that we could lose this place and everywhere like it. So it's like a death in a family. You just don't want to go there. So that's what my emotions just won't go there because it's just extremely painful. I keep going back to the idea that we have artists, explorers, politicians, advocates, general public, we have scientists, we have water quality people. So these things keep me going and keep my gut. Otherwise, I would feel constantly like there's a death in the family. I don't want to feel that way.
No.
When I was 8 or 9 years old, my parents brought me here, and I remember getting on the glass-bottom boat and seeing this beautiful place. We need to get more Floridians to explore their own state.
Yes. For me, everything comes from that experience that you mentioned. It all comes from, and once you have that experience, anything is possible, I like to think, that people will rise up and say, this has to be protected. It's been here thousands of years, it needs to be here thousands more. Why should it change because of us?
That's a great attitude, and I'm going to take that attitude from now on.
Good.
People like us who care in our hearts about the Springs make a point to share the beauty as well as the threats with others in our community. But still, I can't help but feel a sense of loss. And when I do, it takes me back to when I was young and when I first found these springs and how beautiful and amazing they were. And I can only hope that we can get them back to that point today. In The Yearling, author Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings
wrote of Jody Baxter. The young boy who loved springs was described, and it reminded me of my youth. Rawlings wrote of Jody, he went down to the spring, a secret and lovely place. Water bubbled up from nowhere. It cut itself a channel through white limestone and began to run rapidly downhill to make a creek. The bubbling spring would rise forever from the earth. When he was an old man, as old as his father, it would continue.
I can only hope that Jody's spring will continue. But as a diver and someone who cares about magical places, I'll also do whatever I can to help it stay alive forever.
If you're feeling moved or motivated, but don't know how to begin to make a difference, here's some advice from our Springs Explorers. Margaret says, when you enter the springs, you are immersed in them. This experience is life-changing. Put on a mask, enter the springs, tell people what you see. Bob Graham says, talk to your representatives. It really can make a difference. Katie says, gather your children and grandchildren and head for nature. Spend the day, visit often, and revel in the interest for the rest of your life. And Eric says, we have to act now. We can't dream or hope it will be saved. We have to do. Hidden Secrets of Florida Springs is supported by a grant from the Dolores Barr Weaver Fund at the Community Foundation for Northeast Florida. Additional funding comes from the Felburn Foundation and Wekiva Island, where you can experience the real Florida.